I worked for the First National Bank. I'd started as a bookkeeper and worked my way up. I hadn't accumulated a great deal at the time of the panic, but I had some savings. I had a good job. That was the trouble. My savings and my job disappeared at much the same time.
In the early 1930s, the United States experienced the worst depression in her history, an economic slump which turned on its head the prosperity of the 1920s, a slump in which 15 million Americans lost their jobs. But what was it like to live through this Great Depression? This program reconstructs the testimonies of 4 Americans who experienced those hard times. Their words survive because at the end of the decade, they were each interviewed by the Federal Writers Project, an oral history project paid for by the U.S. government. 10,000 Americans were interviewed in all. Their lives, their experiences written down, filed away in the Library of Congress. 10,000 American voices. This is Wall Street, in the heart of New York's financial district. This is where the Great Depression began. In the good times, in the 1920s, the stock exchange had marked the beating pulse of American capitalism. Confidence reflected in soaring share prices, investors buying stock, banking on future prosperity. People thought the boom times were here to stay. The president, Herbert Hoover, spoke of an end to poverty, of unlimited plenty for all. But then, October 25th, 1929, the bubble of confidence burst. Stock traders watched in horror as prices began to drop, and then plunge into free fall. Fortunes evaporated overnight, $30 billion blown away in just a few weeks. The shockwaves of the Wall Street crash were felt across the country. Small banks found themselves besieged by anxious investors, desperate to withdraw their savings before they lost it all. Raymond Tarver was a bank clerk. He described to the Federal Writers Project the collapse of one small-town bank.
We were having breakfast one morning, my wife, Louise, and I, when the telephone rang. It was one of the fellows that I worked with. He said, "Tarver, have you heard the news?" I said, "What news? What's it all about?" "Well," he said, "hurry on down and see." And sure enough, in front of the bank there stood a crowd of employees. The bank was closed and there was a notice to that effect on the door. I had all my savings in that bank. My job hung in the balance. Even so, at first I wasn't so worried about my losses. I was more concerned about our customers. The saddest part was to see the widows who'd probably been left just a little insurance. They'd put it in the bank. I mean, what were they going to live off now?
Herbert Hoover, meanwhile, faced the crisis with an optimistic smile. He said there'd been recessions before. He tried to persuade America the economy was fundamentally sound, that recovery was just around the corner. But the economy depended on people buying things, and with confidence shot to pieces, people held on to their money. They stopped spending. The economy just ground to a halt. All over America, towns found themselves devastated by this crisis of confidence. This, for example, is Lowell, Massachusetts, in the northeastern United States. To some extent, it never recovered from the tragedy that hit it then. Lowell was a mill town, dependent on one main industry, textiles. Here, demand was slowing down even before the crash. Lowell was losing out to mills in the South, where labor costs were cheaper. But after the crash, orders halved. The mills were forced to make cutbacks. Many closed their doors for good. Within a year, 3 out of every 7 mill hands here were unemployed, on the streets, no money in their pockets. The effect on the local economy was devastating.
Back then, I had a store in the Wrightsboro Road. Been a thriving concern from the start. I mean, it was nothing for my husband and me to go out on a party and spend $100 to $200 in a single evening. But then the plants began to close, one by one. People were out of work. They had nothing to eat, no money to spend. The only plant that stayed open was the Buckeye Oil Mill, but even they laid off a number of men, and the rest of them only worked 3 days a week. I mean, some of these folks had been spending their money with me for years, so I couldn't refuse to help them now that they needed me. Besides, we all thought the trouble was only temporary, that the plants would open again in a few weeks or months. So, I let them take goods on credit. I had $6,000 in diamonds. One ring alone was worth $3,000. And I sold them all, with the exception of my engagement and wedding rings. And just kept on restocking my shelves, until one day I found myself with empty shelves and my last dollar gone.
The collapse of the economy cut across American society. It affected not just those on the factory floor, but office workers, clerks, secretaries, traveling salesmen. This footage shows scenes 1 year after the crash at a labor exchange. News of 100 jobs had drawn crowds 5,000 strong. And with every passing month, the lines of the unemployed grew longer. 7 million by 1931, 12 million by 1932.
I thought I'd get another job. I was young enough. I had experience and standing in the town. I was wrong. When I saw there were no jobs to be had locally, I began looking elsewhere. Got a temporary job in the ice plant. But then I came to realize business was so bad they were only keeping me on out of sympathy. And I couldn't stand that. So I quit. I tell you, we learned to count our nickels.
Meanwhile, what of Hoover? Was he, as some historians have said, a do-nothing president? The truth is, he worked hard, persuading big business to fix wages and end the layoffs. He thought big business, not the government, would be the force behind recovery. The trouble was, he still thought of Americans as rugged individualists, thriving best on their own, self-reliant, free of government interference. A proud philosophy well suited to the boom times, but hardly helpful in the face of such hardship. In 1930, a journalist called Louis Adamich visited Lowell and reported on the conditions there. He described the main street, how every third store was closed, how the butchers had stopped ordering turkeys for Thanksgiving, how the barber shops were under threat, people were cutting their hair at home. The only places doing well were the thrift shops, the 5 and 10 cent stores. But what struck him most was the sight of men and women, mostly men, aimless, hopeless. Their dignity as breadwinners, as husbands, as fathers, eroded. What follows are the words of a man interviewed on the streets of New York, his testimony and insight into the mood of despair.
What will you do? What will you do? What will you do? Go hang yourself with your own necktie. I'm 50 years. An old man. I'm strolling around with my hands in my pockets. Suddenly I'm a vagabond. I got specks in my eyes. I'm screaming in my sleep. I ain't human no more. I mean, what's human nature? Clothing, food, shelter, recreation. The moment you wake up, your belly starts to talk, you know? You gotta eat. You get tired out, you gotta lay down. But where's the bed? We ain't animals. They can sleep in a hole in the ground. Nature gave them their own clothing. What shall I do? I ain't a tub of wisdom. I'm a plain old man. Like they say around here, I ain't no thoroughbred. I got an American spine, but a heart from the old world. The only thing is, it's a good God. A wise God. He won't let me live long. That's all.
This is Trinity Church in Manhattan, New York City. It stands directly opposite Wall Street, surrounded by some of America's oldest financial institutions. In the years after the crash, Trinity Church was one of those places in New York where the homeless could come for shelter, where the hungry could get a piece of bread or a bowl of soup. Traditionally, private charity was considered shameful. Rugged individualists don't want help. But they had little choice. Unlike in Britain, where the government gave pay called the dole to those out of work, in America there was no safety net. The American way was sink or swim, and charity, though shameful, was better than starvation. But already many Americans were asking, why should people be subjected to this degree of shame? Was it their fault the system had collapsed? If not, whose responsibility was it to fix the system? Hoover's. Meanwhile, what about life beyond the cities? Here, government inaction was an old story. For 10 years, even before the crash, farmers had suffered hard times. The establishment had turned a blind eye. The files of the Federal Writers Project are chock full of farmers describing the bad times. Too much cotton leading to falling prices, then too little cotton when the boll weevils set to work, destroying crops throughout the South. What follows is the testimony of Moses Austin. He worked for white farmers, taking a share of the crop. He tells of a decade of depression on one southern farm.
Started about wartime. War gets over, soldiers come home. Everything goes wrong on this place. Mr. Oscar, He held and held all our cotton, but the price went down to nothing. Then he sells. We all went hungry that year. Next year, long about July, I see them thunderclouds coming out the west. I says to Miss Jane it's a bad sign. And sure enough, long about August, the boll weevil came. Bless your life, that bug sure romped home that fall. Miss Jane says, this ain't gonna do. We're gonna have to plant some peas. But Mr. Oscar says, he don't want nothing but cotton planted on his farm. He's in debt. Has to raise more cotton to get the money to pay with. Goes down to Columbia, bought even more guano to fertilize the fields. Middle of next May, I saw the boll weevil sitting on the top of them little cotton stalks waiting for the squares to form. So all that guano I hauled bought nothing but another crop of boll weevil. Next few years, we had a crop sometime. But Mr. Oscar, he held and held, waiting for the better price. Summer 31, he has to sell. We ain't got no food, and you can't eat cotton. But cotton's 6 cents a pound. Mr. Oscar goes broke as a convict. Stood by the garbage can, declaring the mess he made of his life. Miss Jane, she is tired of boll weevils, cotton fields, and gullies, and failure. Bundle her things aboard a Southern Railway train, heads west to California. This used to be the finest farm on the Dutch Fork. Now when I stands here and look over at these gullies and weeds and briars and that muddy water on the river, I says to myself, Moses, that muddy water is the blood of this land.
These are some of the most famous Depression photographs ever taken. They show migrant farmers driven from their land. Some from the south, others from further west, where drought had turned fertile soil into a dust bowl. No testimonies were taken of these migrants, but their memories are preserved in their music.
I'm going down this road feeling bad. Oh Lord, I'm going down this road feeling bad. I'm going down this road feeling bad, oh Lord. And I ain't gonna be treated this way. I'm going where the climate suits my clothes. Oh Lord, I'm going where the climate suits my clothes. I'm going where the climate suits my clothes, oh Lord. And I ain't gonna be treated this way. I'm going where that chill wind never blows. Oh Lord, I'm going where that chill wind never blows. I'm going where that chill wind never blows, oh Lord. And I ain't gonna be treated this way. I ain't gonna be treated this way.
In 1932, Herbert Hoover was up for re-election. He returned to his home state of Iowa to begin campaigning. But public opinion had turned against him. Crowds, 2,000 strong, picketed the streets. Meanwhile, in the capital, Veterans from the First World War had come seeking an advance on the bonus they were due. They marched on Washington, joined by farmers and the ranks of the unemployed. These weren't revolutionaries. They were patriotic Americans. But they'd realized what Hoover had not, that in exceptional circumstances, even rugged individualists needed help. Hoover's response shocked the nation.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865, all assembled with a single purpose, to rout the bonus army from government property which they've been occupying without permission. And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States. It's a spectacle unparalleled in the history of the country.
In late 1932, the American people removed Herbert Hoover from office. It was time for a new style of government.
I mean, we were lucky. I know that. Even when times were at their worst. My wife Louise had a cabbage patch, which was a lifesaver. We swapped cabbages for things that we needed. Some people lost everything. It made us realize how you have to look out for each other sometimes. How you can't always make it on your own.
I mean, back when there was money around, we all thought everything was all right with the world, you know? But since the crash, things so unsteady, never knowing when the axe will fall, you see the injustice, the inequality. You begin asking yourself, how long is it going to take before those old birds in Washington realize it's government hell or else? How long are people supposed to suffer before they understand we're not just throwing a load of old heifer dust around here?
As for me, back I can't go. It's too late. Like yesterday, I was standing on the bread line. Was it yesterday? What is it today? Tuesday? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was standing on the bread line and suddenly a cop hollers back up. 200 people on the line. He says to them, back up. So he starts to shove. 2 minutes, there's a fight. 3 broken heads. You know, sometimes you just can't back up no more.